Welcome everyone to this Ex Libris training presentation on becoming an expert with Leganto. That's the name of our series anyway. I'm Kevin Lane Cummings. I'm a training services consultant with Ex Libris. Also here on the line is Jesse Ransom, who is a teaching and learning product specialist for Leganto. And this is session 3 in the series on becoming an expert with Leganto. Today we are providing an overview of digitization and copyright. This is the entire series here. We've already had a couple sessions on automating library processing and bulk rollover of reading lists. And then next month, it'll be optimizing the instructor experience, and then you can see the rest of the spring sessions. You can register for these sessions by going to the Knowledge Center, and it would be the same page you registered for today's session, but in case you didn't get that registration that way, maybe one of your colleagues registered. This is the kind of the path down at the bottom here. Go to the Knowledge Center and then the Leganto subject area and then product area and then training, webinars, and then there's a page called Become an Expert in Leganto. That's also the place where you can look at the recordings of any previous sessions. So those first 2 sessions, the recordings are up, posted on that page. Today's session recording will be posted probably tomorrow on Friday sometime. And also that's a place you can grab the PowerPoint presentations that you're seeing here that I'm showing. If you want to download those and take a look at those. Especially because I have later in the session, I have links to documentations and other trainings, and that way you can click the links and go straight to those documentation. Here is the agenda for the day. We are going to be looking at, of course, digitization and copyright in your Leganto reading lists. And because digitization of physical content and copyright of any kind of reading list are pretty tied together, we're going to be kind of going back and forth between those 2 subjects throughout this session. And I want to emphasize that even though we're covering a lot today, this entire session is really an overview. That's why we call it that, because we definitely don't have time to get into so many details, especially because there are so many different situations in different regions of the country, regions of the world, where you deal with different copyright agencies and things like that, and we just can't address all the possibilities that there might be. But at the end of the session, I will provide links to documentation and training so that you can learn even more about this. Before we even dig into the very first line on the agenda there, I do want to mention what we will not be covering. In case you joined this class thinking, oh good, I can finally learn how to integrate Leganto with regional copyright agencies. Nope, we're not going to cover that. But I'm also not going to be talking about what you must do or you must not do. I can't do that. I'm not a copyright lawyer. I can't advise you how to deal with copyright with your institution. I can show you what Leganto and Alma can do for you and how to configure and implement the workflows to support that work. But that happens after you figure out what you must do for copyright, especially regarding copyright. Digitization, of course, is its own little thing, and you might have even started doing some digitization, maybe when patrons place requests for digitization. And but today's session is, of course, about digitizing when you're talking about course materials. So let's go through some of the questions for you to consider before you even think about what Alma and Leganto will do for you. You have to answer these questions before you start because it will drive what choices you make. And I'm just putting them here at the beginning, but throughout this session, I will give you the ideas of how you can use Leganto because that will help guide your team's discussion about these questions. And this is what I can't really answer these questions for you. It's not that kind of thing because it's going to be specific to your institution, to your region, and so forth. But hopefully it will help when you think about your own workflow. So first question, what do you want to do or what do you need to do as related to copyright at your institution? Kind of broad, but which steps of a process, of a workflow do you want to automate? And which ones do you want to do manually? That kind of question will be much easier to answer once you get through today's session. Here's a pretty specific one. Do you want instructors to be able to request copyright review? And do you want instructors to be able to request digitization? Once you think about those questions, especially after today, then you'll be able to apply some of the ideas that we're talking about. So let's dig into our first major topic here, copyright considerations. Whether you're talking about digitizing some physical items or just the electronic resources and things like that, what are the copyright considerations you have to take into account, and how can Alma and Leganto help you with those when building reading lists for your courses? I have two areas to discuss within this one topic. First, how can Leganto and Alma help you determine which citations require copyright review? And then the second one is, how can you use Alma to track fair use or fair dealing decisions that were made by your instructors, if you do allow them to make those decisions? All right, so let's cover the first one here. Leganto can help you determine which citations require copyright approval. So for this, there is a configuration menu where you set the default copyright status for the citations as they are added to Leganto reading lists. This is what the configuration table looks like down below. In red, that's the path that you go to get to that configuration table. And once you're there, you can set different separate options based on the different types of repository resources that are being put into citations. For instance, you might have digital resources at your institution. You might have electronic resources that you're subscribing to from vendors. There might be some physical resources. There's also could be citations in reading lists that come from CDI citations, records. There could be non-repository citations, and there could be brief citations. So whichever ones you have turned on, you can set Alma and Leganto to configure a default, to provide a default copyright status. So with these automation settings, we could say, for example, we never want to worry about copyright if it's in our electronic repository. Electronic repository are those resources that you subscribe to from vendors and that you have activated, brought into your institution zone in Alma. So in that case, you would configure the electronic repository setting here that I've got highlighted to that, so that those citations are automatically approved, that you don't need any kind of copyright check on that. You just assume that it's part of your institutional repository, it's part of your institution zone in Alma, then it must be fine to be approved here. Or you might even set it not required, like I have down here on our physical repository. So again, a physical item doesn't require copyright approval because we already own the thing. On the other hand, if a non-repository citation gets added to a course reading list, you probably want the copyright approval process to be required, like I have it set here. So you can use this table to set the default copyright status for all these different types of citations, so that the ones that don't require any copyright, they can move quickly on to the next step in the process. By the way, you don't have to use them at all. You can leave the default on this table, which is not determined, and you can keep them that way, or keep most of them that way, however you want it to do it, to set up the system in advance, so to speak, so that it does any work for you right away, or it doesn't. Just some quick options. Now, the effects of doing this, the workflow implications of doing this, each of these citations has a copyright status field. And that field will say whether copyright is required or not yet determined, or whatever it is. So if you do some automatic flagging of copyright from that table that we were just looking at, then you could filter a list of citations to only show you those that have a certain copyright status. For example, here we're looking at a citation that doesn't require us to check for copyright approval. So we could filter this out of a citation list, and then we won't have to work on it. We'll only work on the ones that for some reason are required, or there's some other step of the workflow process. It just kind of speeds things up, so my list of citations is not clogged with stuff that I don't need to do. The other copyright consideration that I want to get right out of the start of this session is the next thing, tracking fair use or fair dealing decisions. So your instructors may flag, or you may want them to flag, some of their citations that they're putting on their reading lists, and they may need to place this place this flag, so to speak, the fair use or fair dealing. And so this is quite common at institutions that didn't use a reading list tool before Leganto. That's where we see this being very helpful, because before Leganto, probably your instructors uploaded the citations and the reading lists into something like your learning management system. It had nothing to do with you in the library, and maybe you right now don't have enough time with your library staff to handle dealing with finding all the copyright approvals and everything. So you can configure Leganto so that when the instructor uploads a file, they have to make a copyright declaration. It could look something like this. And you can see there's a couple of choices on this list. This would be a place where an instructor has just uploaded a file, a PDF, and you're asking the instructor to make some choices right away. Either they personally hold the copyright for the item, or this resource falls within fair use guidelines, or it needs copyright review. The text on this little pop-up slide, these radio button choices, totally customizable by you, so that you can have the different options that you want and have them say the things you want. But again, this would speed up the process, because if the instructor can declare fair use or fair dealing, if that's the term that is used in your region, then again, you don't have to take care of it on the library end, and things will go much faster. What does that mean? In workflow, then this data maps to what you see inside of Alma. So in this example, I've got a citation that I'm looking at in Alma, and the copyright status on the citation is whatever the instructor chose when they were looking at the file, the uploaded in Leganto. In this case, it says the copyright status is self-declared. That copyright status is stored in Alma. It's reportable in the future, so we will always know it was the instructor that made that declaration. Then you do have the option to have Alma automatically mark these citations as complete. When the copyright status comes in as self-declared, for example, you could set up Alma to automatically complete the citation itself. So you wouldn't even have to deal with it at all. It just goes on the reading list right away. So example, if that way you only need to review the citations and files that the instructor indicated they want help reviewing. Back on this previous slide, that bottom option, needs review, that's the ones that you would want to take care of, or you're being asked to take care of by the instructor, and you wouldn't have to touch the rest. That's a great one. All right, that's some copyright considerations. And before I get into this next section, I want to remind you that we do encourage your questions throughout this training. And so if you do have questions, send them in the WebEx chat and address them to all panelists so that both Jesse and I can see those. I know your microphones are muted and things like that, but you should know, and Jesse should know, that we do have time today to take a look at some of these things in more detail. If there are some questions that come through that would work better to be demonstrated in Alma or something like that. So feel free to start thinking about those as we're going through here. And if we get to the end of the session, we have a little time, you can even ask us to take a look at some things there.
You know what, Kevin, actually, there's a question in the chat that is very relevant for right now. It says, is that fair use text hyperlinked? And the answer to that is yes. I can actually paste in the chat for all of you the way to do that. But yeah, you can add links into the configuration here. So if you have created institutional guidelines for how to determine fair use, you can have that link out to another page. So yeah, I'll put that in the chat so you can see how to do it.
Thanks, Jesse. Okay, so the next section is kind of the meat of today's session. It's the place you start actually making some big changes. I already talked about a little bit of configurations that you could do in Alma and Leganto, but here's where the rubber meets the road, or whatever cliche you want to do. How to set up workflows and tracking to keep up with the digitization and copyright work that you need to do. So I've got quite a few subjects in this topic. And the first one I want to get to is to understand or determine which resources need digitization. So if you want to configure Leganto to allow it, the instructor can submit a course-related digitization request in Leganto. So a couple minutes ago, we were looking at the instructor submitting a copyright approval request to you. You can also set it up so the instructor requests digitization. That would look something like this. Here is that same pop-up where the instructor is creating a citation, and they can place a request, a digitization request in Leganto. So copyright approval may be required depending on the digitization and copyright approval rules, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. It's kind of the big part of this today's session is building some rules that check on this. And depending on those rules, if someone requests digitization, that may trigger a request for copyright. The instructor and the library staff can view that copyright approval status if it is required. And in fact, the copyright can be automatically approved by a rule. And if that happens, that will show up right after your instructor places the request. So again, depending on these rules that we're going to build in a couple minutes, this could happen very quickly. Then there may be some library tasks that get added to the task lists. For instance, we've got the task list called citations, copyright rating for approval. No surprise, that would be some citation requests that somebody has placed a request, an instructor has placed a request to be copyright approved. And there could be also something on the requests tab, the requests task group, within the digitization requests that require approval. We're going to talk more about the task lists a little later in this session, and we also are going to talk about these rules, but I also want to tell you that there could be the library staff that requests digitization to happen. So again, a library staff member could submit a course-related digitization request in Alma, and the way you do that is from a citation. And when you're looking at a citation in Alma, you select the path here that you can see in red, starts with Manage Fulfillment Options to place a library physical digitization request. Again, in this situation, depending on the rules that you create, that we're going to talk about in a minute, copyright approval may be required because of that digitization request. Or it could be automatically approved. The instructor and the library staff can both view the copyright approval status. So the instructor can see the status in Leganto. Library staff can see the status of this approval in Alma. And again, there might be task lists involved in this. We might have going on to the citations, copyright rating for approval, and the requests, digitization request approval, those two task lists. Again, we'll talk about task lists in just a minute. The next big step to getting ready for all this, to kind of trigger all these steps and workflow, is to understand or determine which resources require copyright approval. And there's a couple different ways to have this set up. You can configure Leganto to allow the instructor to ask for copyright clearance when they're adding citations to their reading list. We saw that option, and this would be the situation where the citation maybe already has the file, such as if the instructor uploads it and attaches the file themselves. Here's what that looks like, the request section down at the bottom, and then it says you can ask copyright clearance for your digital object, and that's where the instructor can ask for that clearance. When they're uploading the file, here's a PDF file that the instructor is uploading at the citation. Then Alma is going to check against the rules you build. Again, we're going to build them in a minute. And those rules tell Alma whether to approve the copyright automatically right away or to wait for manual approval. And as you can see down here, the bottom screenshot, that's from Alma. And that's after the rule is run, after this happens, the instructor, this library will see the status on the citation in Alma. It's way down here. It says waiting for approval. So you can tell that this was not automatic. The rule did not approve this copyright status automatically. And here is why: exceeded copyright work percentage. We'll talk more about that, but that is the rule that told Alma, do not set the approval on this copyright. Instead, get a manual approval because it exceeds the copyright work percentage. I'll explain what how that rule has got set up in just a minute. The instructor can see the status of the copyright clearance in Leganto, and then the task lists. This one goes to those same task lists, copyright waiting for approval, and the requests go for digitization. Will go to the digitization requests approval. Now, the instructor's not the only one who could ask for copyright clearance. You folks could. Staff at the library can indicate copyright clearance is required. So when you're on the edit citation screen, that's where this screenshot is in Alma, editing a citation, and you're on the copyright attributes tab, you can check the box right here that says copyright auditing required. And when that happens, most of the other fields that you see here will suddenly appear, and you can add any information that you have if you're able to determine the approval. And in fact, at the top of the page, you can save it, save this citation, and then that goes back to the main citation list, and someone else can approve the copyright. But if you have the ability to approve the copyright or do the research, then click Save and Manage Approval, the other spot up there, and that goes into the approval workflow. No matter which one you click, if this is where you start telling Alma that you need the copyright auditing that is required, the copyright rules will be checked to see what happens next, including this may be able to be automatically approved by the Alma rules. So I keep mentioning these digitization and copyright rules. So let me show you how to leverage those to do everything that we've been talking about and the rest of the stuff we're going to talk about today's session. After these instructors and your staff indicate which resources need digitization, which resources need copyright approval, Alma runs the rules. So I'm going to show you how to use these to speed things up. First, a quick overview before I actually show you how to build a rule. These rules can automate, to some extent, the process of deciding whether the use of a resource complies with copyright. So for the copyright purposes, that usually means determining whether you can use it under fair use or fair dealing. Those are specific to your institution, to your region, and so the copyright rules that you're under. But the concept is true across Alma and Leganto, all the institutions on the call here. So you'll build the rules. Then Alma can check the citation against those rules and flag the items in certain ways depending on what you need. For example, you could build a rule that looks to see if the instructor is using less than 10% of the work. So maybe in your region, that's an allowable fair use, and you can just approve it automatically. Alma can approve it automatically. Or another example, maybe this is the first article that's ever been used from this journal and issue for this course. In which case, again, fair use is that you can use that without any more checking. These are just two examples. They have to make some common examples. You may have other situations for which you'd like to build a rule. And you should know that all these rules that I'm going to show how to build, they can only look at the metadata for the citation, the metadata of the course, and the history of how the citation has been used in this course or in other courses. These rules can't check some of the more things like, is it really needed? Is it really helping the students learn something from the course? That, of course, is a discussion for you and the instructors and so forth. The rules then trigger other workflows for copyright approval. The rules could also be part of digitization workflows, but they don't have to be. For example, if the instructor already uploaded the digitized content, then you can still use these rules, but just for the copyright part. And as with other rules in Alma, when you see the list of these rules, these digitization and copyright rules, they work just like the other rules in Alma. Alma starts at the first rule at the top of the list and checks to see if it applies to a citation. And if not, Alma works its way down the list of rules until it finds one to apply to that situation. So of course you want the most restrictive, the most specific rules at the top. And if no rules apply, you'll have to go all the way down to the bottom of the list and see the default rules. Here is where those rules are. Follow this path in Alma, in the red font up there, to get to the rules list. And this is what it looks like in the screenshot, but instead of just showing you a screenshot, I'm going to show it for real. Let's switch to Alma, and I'm going to log into my training environment here in Alma and show you this list for real. Again, this is a training environment. We've talked about this before in previous sessions, that this is a little strange. The data in here is a little strange. The workflow is a little strange because we're just using it to show things to folks like you. We don't actually are a library, and we're not using it in the ways most libraries would use. But the processes that I'm going to show you right now in building these rules, it really does work the way it would for you. So to build these digitization and copyright rules, it is a configuration. So we go down here to the lower left click in the menu, excuse me, the configuration menu, and it's in the fulfillment menu. And then we look for copyright management, which is way over here on the right side. And the one we're looking for is right here, digitization and copyright rules. Now, this digitization, they call it at the top, digitization and workflow rules. Doesn't even say copyright, but in fact, copyright is in here. But not only that, there are a lot of digitization rules in here that have nothing to do with courses at all. They're not going to have anything to do with copyright or courses. Patron partial digitization. You know, if a patron requests digitization of some material, here's a rule that's going to apply to that. May not have anything to do with your courses. So I just want you to know those rules are here. This is the place to make them if you want to set up some automated rules for things like patron digitization. But today I'm not going to be talking about that because we're going to stick with just courses and reading lists and citations. And the one I want to find just as a demonstration down here, there's an auto-approved one called first chapter requested. Here it is, auto-approved first chapter requested. This is just an example. I'm going to edit it using the row action menu here so we can see how this was built. Besides giving it a good name and description, I should actually not go too quickly over the fact that this name is actually really helpful because this will show up on those citations when a rule is applied to a citation. So having a name here that is very explicit and explanatory, that it explains exactly what's happening so that staff who need to conduct some kind of copyright research will know what rule was triggered to bring it to the whatever state it's in. Anyway, like many rules, there is input parameters and there's something that happens because of those input parameters. You call it, sometimes they're output parameters. In this case, it's a workflow setup. So let's take a look at the input parameters that this rule is checking. First of all, it says material required dates are equal to true. In other words, the citation does have some dates connected to it on when the material is required. That would come from the course. And in other words, this rule says there must be dates, start and end dates of when the material is required. If there's no start and end dates, then apparently it's not going to be used in a course or it didn't come that way. And so this rule will not get triggered. The request type must be a course-related digitization. This digitization rule is not about patron requested digitization or anything like that. It's only going to deal with course-related digitization. And before I go too far, I should tell you these 4 parameters, these are connected with Boolean and, so all of them must be true for this rule to be turned on. All 4 of these. The copyright record must be related to the course. Yes, it must be true that it's related to a course and that the total copyright number of chapters equals 1. In other words, this is the first chapter requested from this work. And if all of these parameters are true, then this rule will get executed. What does that mean? Well, these things will happen. We've got a document delivery that's going to have an attachment. That's the digitization. It does require copyright clearance approval to happen. It needs it. It can't go without it. And when we check the copyright clearance, then which ones, we've got a choice of these radio buttons on what do we want to happen. In this case, we're allowing it to be automatically approved. And why? Because of a legal exception, namely that we're just using the one chapter and it's okay. That's a legal exception. There is a list of possible reasons here. This is customizable by you. And so build this list as however you need it, and then choose the one that you want to apply in this particular case. So in this case, if a citation is created and it requires copyright approval, it gets sent to the rule list. The rule list checks it. And if all of these fit the circumstance, it says, yes, it requires approval. And yes, we're giving it to you with a legal exception. So just to give you another idea of how this kind of thing goes, let's take a look all the way at the bottom. We have the default digitization flow. So if none of the rules apply, it's always good to check the default. What is the default rule? There is no parameters because this is the rule that's going to happen if none of the other rules have it, get executed at all. And we have a digitization target again. It's the digital inventory representation. There is not approval required, but there is copyright clearance required, and it's in parallel to the digitization workflow. That means it can happen at the same time as the workflow, and you can see the rest of the options here. By the way, because of a lot of options that are going on here, it's always good I always try to remind you that if you're not sure what any of these mean or how they are used, go up to the help menu at the top there and click help for this page. That will take you straight to the documentation page in the Knowledge Center about this page, whatever you're looking at. So it's a quick way to get there without having to leave the page you're working on. So hopefully that gives you at least a general idea of what the rules require, how they're going to be executed, and you can see you could build lots and lots of rules. And just a reminder, these rules are tested in order. When a citation gets added to a reading list, it will go through this list of rules to see which one applies. And so again, you want your most restrictive rules up at the top so they catch your really unique examples, and then more general things down at the bottom of the list, and you move them up and down by these arrows. It's just like other rules lists in Alma. All right, once you build those rules, we can look at what happens, what the rules are going to trigger, what some of the kinds of things that happen after that. For instance, I mentioned before that if copyright approval is required, then the request is pushed to a task list. You'll find the same task in two different task lists. You'll find it up at the top there in the Other Requests group called Digitization Requests Approval, and down below in Citations, Copyright Waiting for Approval. So you can work from either list. There's a little bit of difference, and I'll show you the differences on where you go from here. But it doesn't matter. The task appears in both, and when you're done with it, it will get removed from both lists. So the copyright approval tasks will only be created for citations where the rules say they can't have automatic approval. If they have automatic approval, they're not going to be waiting for your approval. So let's first look at the bottom task list, that citations copyright waiting for approval. So if you click on that, this is what that task list looks like. It's a list of citations. It's got all the citations that have that copyright status of waiting for approval. So because this filter is applied, you can see that copyright status waiting for approval. You won't see any other citations that have a different copyright status. So the one at the top does have waiting for approval, but it also says work available electronically. That's a rule. That was the name of a rule specifically. So apparently we've got a rule in our system here that says if you got a citation on a course list, but that material is actually already available electronically, then set the copyright status to waiting for approval. Again, you can see that that's pretty helpful for the person who's working this list, who needs to know why is this citation on the list, because the work is available electronically. So that might change their workflow from here. Other details of the citation are right here for us to see, like there's the course name right over here, course code, and the reading list name is here, and the ISBN and MMSID and things like that. That's all right here for our use. If you click that link right there, the waiting for approval, work available electronically, that will take you to the that'll take you to the copyright status field. Let me see, get the right thing. I got to say this right. It will take you to the approval request list, filtered just to show this one citation. And then you can proceed to any actions for confirming the copyright. On the other hand, if you look at the bottom citation on my little list here, it says copyright status waiting for approval. Yeah. But there's no link. It's not hyperlinked to anywhere else. It's not going to take you to the approval request list. In that case, the copyright status was added manually. It wasn't a rule. It was added manually at some point, and you just need to figure it out on your own. I'll talk a little later about manual workflows, but that's how it kind of shows up on your citation list. If you go to the other task list that we saw a few minutes ago, the one that's called Other Requests, Digitization Request Approval, you end up on this approval request list. But this time the tasks will be mixed in with others that may not be related to courses, like patron digitization approvals. So you might change the filter at the top to only show the approvals tasks associated with courses, if that's what you're working on. For instance, you also see that there's not much information about where this citation came from or why it's needed. It does show the course code there, but it doesn't display the rest of the context. It doesn't show the reading list name, doesn't show any other metadata about the resource. It shows the request notes, at least over here. But it's not a lot of details. But again, that's because this page is really about all kinds of digitization. So from the row action menu here, you could work on the copyright approval for this resource, or you could work on the digitization as well from here. When you complete the task here, the task will be removed from this list. It will be removed from the other list. So you can choose to work on from either task list, whatever fits your workflow better. So if your duties are to check the copyright approval and digitization for all kinds of resources, not just the ones for courses, then maybe you'll start here, because this has got a lot more than just those for courses, and maybe that's why your duties are, but that's fine. But if you're specifically working on citations for courses, you'll probably be working on the previous list, the citations copyright waiting for approval task list. That might be a better place to work for your projects. That's processing and tracking copyright approvals with kind of a side order of digitization. But no matter how it started, if you have a digitization request, whether it's from the instructor originally or the library staff, eventually, maybe after the copyright approval, you are going to have to process that digitization request. So let's see how that happens. For some institutions, depending on how you define the rules, this workflow could happen at the same time in parallel to the copyright approval workflow. Other institutions like to set it up so that the copyright approval has to happen first. What's the point of digitizing it if we don't get copyright approval? And then the second thing is to digitize it. So it depends, again, on how you want your processes at your institution, and you set it up on those rules on whether it's allowed to be done in parallel to at the same time, digitizing and copyright approval, or separate. So for digitization, there is a workflow. It's built into Alma to take you through the process. First, someone picks the item from the shelf and then brings it back to a circulation desk. Alma routes it to the appropriate digitization department or digitization desk, and then someone at that location digitizes the item. Those digitized files are added to the citation, and you can set it up to do that automatically so that while you're sitting there, you scan it in and it just gets attached right to the citation that you're working on. Also, there are certain situations where it has to be done manually. For example, if there already is a file attached to the citation, then Alma won't just overwrite it with a new one. They're going to want to get you to get in there and make an intelligent human decision on whether it needs to be added. Then the request for digitization is marked as complete, automatically marked by Alma. And then back at the circulation desk, Alma says it's got to go back to that physical item's got to go back to its original location. Now, this is how it would be done at most large institutions where there's only a couple of circ desks that do digitization, or maybe it's even a back room kind of thing. If you have a small library staff, maybe just you have a couple people who work on digitization, you may not need Alma to do this entire process and have it keep going back, scanned in at the desk, sent out to here, scanned in again when it arrives. In fact, it can be really annoying if you're the person doing all the steps, so you have to keep scanning it into Alma every time you go to the step. So a few months ago, Alma got a new feature added. It's called the short digitization workflow. Basically, it eliminates the steps of routing the item around through the system. And the way you kind of trigger this is you do it from the reading list. So if you're the person who looks at the reading list, you pull the book from the shelf, you scan the item, you upload the item, you complete the citation, you reshelf the book, you can do it all from that citation view on the reading list. Technically, the same things are happening on the back end with all the rules that you set up and everything. You just make this short workflow happen by starting from the citation on the reading list. Then the digitization can get done essentially on one page of Alma as you click through there. All right, that is all of the copyright workflows, digitization workflows, tracking things. I've got some additional options. These are not typically necessarily part of what you'll be doing, but there's certainly some good options. But again, I'm going to pause and see if Jesse has anything we need to talk about before we move on.
Good timing, actually. There is a question here. How would this workflow change if we needed to duplicate a reading list? I think this came in when you were talking about the digitization workflow. So if you have a citation that already has the file attached to it and you duplicate the citation or duplicate the reading list, that file stays attached. So you wouldn't need to, scan it again. You can keep track of that. If that wasn't your question, please put another note in here for me.
Thank you. All right. These additional options, I have a couple of different ones here. And the first one I want to talk about is the option to add a copyright statement onto the scan that your patrons will see, your students will see. So you can add it to scans, you can add it to other course materials, regardless of whether you use any of the rules or anything we've been talking about. You can configure Alma to automatically add copyright statements to the scans and to other course materials. This is an example of what it might look like. That a patron, a student, clicks on an item to read it, but this message pops up. You can customize the text of this message, and you can customize where it appears. The person reading it has to see this and has to click continue to go on to actually read the material. The place to configure when the statement appears is this configuration menu. It's in the Leganto configuration. It's called copyright setting, the copyright declaration notice. And you can have it appear on electronic. It's kind of like the first one we saw. You can have it appear for electronic resources or digital resources or so forth. If you leave it blank on that configuration, then the copyright statement will appear nowhere. You can also say that it should appear only if there is a copyright record, which means the citations have been worked on by those digitization and copyright rules. And the next thing you configure, as you might guess, is the actual text of this notice. That is actually in the configuration menu, but it's in the fulfillment menu. And that one's called the copyright declaration, Leganto digitization request copyright declaration. That's a mouthful of words, but that's the place to do it. The last two options I'll move kind of quickly through. Licensing via external agencies, and the copyright auditing process. So I don't have much to say about this because this is where we're getting into the details of your region. But there is documentation about at least some key external agencies that maybe you work with. So in the United Kingdom, those folks often have to use CLA, DCS, and then documentation and links to documentation and a video training is available here. In the United States, a lot of institutions use CCC. And then if you're in Norway, you use Bulk. Those are the ones we have quick access to, external agencies that we have quick access to that you can read about how to do processing copyright, processing those licensing anyways by those external agencies. If you try to click on the links right here, right now, they won't work in your WebEx. But the way to get the links here is to download this slide presentation that I'm showing you. And again, that's found on the same page where you registered for this training session. So go there and grab that and download those or click on those. If you're in one of these three regions, United Kingdom or United States or Norway, but you don't use these external agencies, take a look at this documentation. This might end up being very helpful for you to kind of speed up your workflows that you're doing so that you don't have to do so much yourself. The second, or I guess we're now at the third subject of kind of optional things, is you can use Leganto to help you manage the auditing process of the copyright that you're doing. Now that there's so much data in your system, in Alma and in Leganto system, about what the material was used for, which courses, how it was used, how many students had access to it, what were the dates, all that kind of thing. All that's in the copyright attributes tab of the citation, when I mentioned this before, and it's filled in anytime you manage a citation's copyright status using Alma's copyright approval system. So For example, the number of students right there, that's coming from the course. There's details about the pages here. These dates are automatically assigned, but you can change them, and then students will only be able to view the inventory when it's approved and within the dates and so forth. That's why it's here. But because all this data is stored in Alma, it's reportable in analytics. This gets pushed into the Alma analytics system, and there's 2 out-of-the-box reports that can help you get started. So if you go into the Alma Analytics and go to the catalog and dig your way through this, there's one called the CLA reporting template for the UK, and another one is the copyright reporting template for Australia. These have been reports built in analytics by Ex Libris staff. And maybe you're not in the UK or in Australia. Take a look at those reports anyway. They might get you a long way toward having some reports that you need yourself, and you can customize them. And those of you who are in other regions, if you come up with a really great report that seems to help you a lot, be sure to kind of publish that so that other institutions in your region can see it. Maybe be sure to put your region as part of the name of the report so that folks can use these reports. The data here can be really useful for anyone to get analytics reports about copyright. I've got a couple of alternative copyright workflow options. It's almost completely ignores everything we talked about so far, which might be surprising that I'm doing this so late in the class, but I'm waiting until now because now that you've seen all the other things that Alma can do, it will make more sense when I'm explaining these, which you could choose. You could choose to do it, but I have to use some terminology that I've been talking about before so that these two make sense. And as you'll see why it's kind of surprising that I would talk about this. One of them is, can you manage copyright manually? And what if you don't want to manage copyright at all? So let's talk about managing things manually. And yes, you can. You can skip all those rules, all that automation that I showed you earlier. For instance, on a reading list, on the list of citations, you can change the copyright status of one or more citations. And obviously, this is based on your own determination when you're looking at the citation, whatever research you need to do. It doesn't go through any rule checking. It's just up to the library staff member to make the decision. If you do it this way, there is no change in the visibility in Leganto. And that's different than when you use the rules. Visibility can be controlled by the course dates and other things that the rules control. You're going to have to separately set the visibility. Maybe you want that. Maybe that's part of your plan. That's fine. Also, the information about copyright, it's not stored on the copyright attributes tab of the citation. Again, when there's rules that run, historical information about which rules were executed, what changes to copyright occurred, all those are stored with the citation for the future, not here with the manual method. So changing the copyright status is, with manually, it's really just for information purposes. There's no subsequent workflow implication. It doesn't change anything down the road. You might say this is really lightweight copyright. Extremely lightweight copyright is none at all. So yeah, some institutions choose not to use any copyright management at all. Maybe your library staff doesn't currently manage copyright and you only came to the session because you thought you had to manage copyright because now you use Leganto, but no, you don't have to. You will want to make a couple of configuration changes because basically for uploaded files, you're going to rely on the instructor ensuring the copyright complies with the resource complies with copyright policies. And then you'll have Leganto just mark the citation as copyright approved. So in this case, you can see in the red box there, it's not asking the instructor to choose or to make a declaration that it's fair use. It just says, if you upload this, you must determine, you, the instructor, must determine that it's not in violation of copyright. So you're going to want to configure things to say this. The course reserves automatic statuses table, which we saw earlier. There's a parameter called citation upload file parameter, and just have it set to complete. When a citation is uploaded, it's complete. It's done. Then you want to configure the file upload copyright options mapping table. We used this at the very beginning of the session when I said you could make an option for instructors to declare fair use. In this case, you just use that setting to choose at least one option that matches to either fair use or self-declared, because only those two options can be auto-completed. And then you just put in text like you see here, where it's not an option, it's just a requirement that they determine it's fair use or self-declared. And then you just ignore all the tasks that pop up for citations with uploaded files. That is an option. At a tiny institution where your instructors know what they're doing, for lack of a better way to say that, that's perfectly fine. And like I say, you just want to make a couple little configurations to speed things along and make sure it's blatantly obvious for the instructors. So that's most of what I have for you today. So if you have some other questions you want to ask, be sure to send them in the chat. And I'm going to pause before I even go into the additional resources to see what has come so far, Jesse.
Okay, there are actually a couple questions that are very similar to each other. And also kind of extensions on that one about duplicating a reading list. There's some questions about what happens in duplication compared to rollover from a copyright and also from the copyright perspective and also from the perspective of the files. So I'll just talk about this a little bit. When you roll over a reading list, whether you do the instructor rollover or the bulk library rollover, you can customize as part of the rollover what you want to have happen with the copyright records. One of the options is to have them copied, meaning if it was already approved, it will continue to be approved. Another option is to have them reset or recalculated, and recalculated checks against the rules engine to see, if things can be approved automatically or not. When you duplicate a reading list, not rollover, but duplicate, the copyright setting is reset. So that means that it checks against that default copyright status table where you can say for certain types of citations, physical items, electronic items, what should the default copyright status be? It resets it to whatever you have in that status. So that's the copyright on a duplicate. That's what happens with the copyright on a duplicate. And the reasoning here actually is that the copyright status is tied to the course, not the reading list, but the course. So when you're approving the copyright for something, it is for the use in that specific course for that number of students within those date ranges. So when you roll over a reading list, the new one is associated with a course. But when you duplicate a reading list, that duplicated version of your list isn't associated with a course. So that's really the difference between the two and why copyright is handled differently when you roll over a list versus duplicate a reading list. The files themselves, the files that are attached to the citations, will carry over, or they should carry over. If they don't, put in a support ticket. But when you duplicate a reading list that has where there are files attached to the citation or associated with the citation, those files should copy over.
Great, thanks very much. Go ahead.
Now I was going to say there's another one here that's not related to that, but should I take it now?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. The next one is it possible through analytics to run a report of all of the lists which include uploaded files, regardless of which copyright option was selected? Yes, it is possible to do that in analytics. I'll do a little bit of digging and see if I can find the right field to do that. You can also see this in Alma. If you look at, for example, the citation screen, the list that has all of your citations, one of the filtering options or facet options on that screen is whether there's a file attached. So you can also actually see every single citation in Alma that has a file associated with it. But in the meantime, I'll look up and see if I can get exactly the right field in analytics for you.
Great, thanks very much. We have the list here of documentation. Again, to access this list and quickly click on these links, you're going to want to download this slide set that I have here. But you can see it covers a lot of the subjects we went through today, and obviously didn't have time to dig in further, but there's a lot here. There is also a couple other training videos. One is about specifically managing copyright for citation, and another one, Leganto Alma copyright management. So to finish up here, I wanted to do a little marketing of next month. The next session in the Become an Expert in Leganto series. I will be talking about the optimizing the instructor experience. I should say I and Jesse and I. We will highlight specific features that your library may want to set up to promote to instructors so that they can learn about things that's available in Leganto, and we'll cover tips for configuring Leganto so that it creates a streamlined, simplified experience for those instructors. Because if it's easier for them to do, they're more likely to do it. That's 4 weeks from now. That's Thursday, April 14th. And if you haven't already registered for that session, you can do so on the same place where you registered for today's session. So if you haven't already, Jesse, could you throw that URL into the chat so that folks can register for next month's class? That's also the page where you'll download the presentation slides I have here, the links to the documentation and so forth. A recording for today's session will probably be on that page tomorrow sometime. But for today, thank you. Thanks for joining us. As you leave this WebEx session, your browser will automatically open up a survey, and please take just the moment that it'll take to fill that out and let us know what you thought of the session, because we do offer this training series several times a year, and we want to make it good. We want to make it better. So it's if there's some suggestions of things we can add in here or things we don't really need to talk about, let us know so that next time it'll be even better. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great day, week, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.